Earlier in this section, we wrote this code to see if we're in the development environment. If yes, we enabled Morgan to log the HTTP requests, and we also logged this message on the console. So this console.log is JavaScript programmers' oldest friend. We use it all the time for debugging. The problem with this approach, however, is that sometimes when we are done with them, we delete them or comment them out, but sometime later, we may need them, so we have to write the code again or remove the comment. This approach is very tedious. A better way to log messages for the purpose of debugging is to use the debug package in Node. With debug, we're going to replace all these console.log statements with a call to a debug function, and then we can use an environment variable to enable or disable debugging. This way, we don't have to come back to our code and modify the code. We don't have to delete these console.log or debug statements. We don't have to comment them out. We can control them from the outside using an environment variable. But more importantly, we can also determine the level of debugging information we want to see. Maybe sometime we're working on a database problem. Perhaps we only want to see the debugging information related to the database. So again, we don't have to come back to the code and modify all these console.log statements. So let me show you how to use the debug package. Back in the terminal, let's install debug. Beautiful. Now this is telling me that there is a newer version of NPM available. It just got released perhaps a minute ago. So it's suggesting me to update it, but I'm not going to do that because I want the course to be consistent with the version that I installed at the beginning. Now, back to our index module on the top, let's load the debug module. This require function here returns a function. So we call this function and give it an argument. And this argument is an arbitrary namespace that we define for debugging. For example, we can define a namespace like app:startup. Now, when we call this function with this argument, we get a function for writing debugging messages in this namespace. So let's call that function startup debugger. Startup debugger. Potentially, we can have another debugger for debugging database related messages. So once again, we load the debug module. We get a function. We call that function, give it a namespace like app::db, and this will return a debugging function. So we get it and store it in db debugger. Okay? Now here on line 9, we're going to replace this console.log statement with a call to startup debugger function. So startup debugger, like that. Now potentially, somewhere in the application we can have some database work, and there we may need to write some debugging information. So we can use our other debugger function, so db debugger, connected to the database. Something like that. Now we're going back to the terminal and use an environment variable to determine what kind of debugging information we want to see in the console. So here we set an environment variable called debug. We set this to app::startup. That means with this, we're going to see only the debugging messages that are part of this namespace, app::startup. Now, if you run the application, look, we got app startup, and here's our message. Now, next time I run this application, maybe I don't want to see any debugging information. So we can reset this environment variable to nothing, run the application again. Look, we no longer see this debugging message. Or we may want to see debugging messages for multiple namespaces. So we can set our environment variable to app::startup, app::db. With this, we will see the debugging messages in these two namespaces. Or if you want to see all the debugging messages for our app namespace, we can use a wildcard. This way we don't have to repeat each of them individually. Now when we run the application, look, we see the messages in different namespaces. So app startup and appdb. And the beautiful thing about this debug module is that it color codes the namespace, so we can easily distinguish various debugging messages. We don't get that with console.log. Now there is also a faster way to set the level of debugging we want to see, so we don't have to explicitly set the environment variable using the export command. We can set the environment variable at the time of running our application. So let me clear the console. Let's say this time I only want to see debugging messages in app:/db namespace. So we said debug, set it to app:/db, now space, run our application either with node or nodemon. So this is a shortcut to set an environment variable, in this case debug, and run the application at the same time. And one last thing. In this particular demo, I created two debugging functions, startup and db debugger. But in a real world scenario, you may not necessarily need multiple debugging functions in the same file or in the same module. If that's the case, you can simplify your code by changing the name of this debugger function to debug. For example, in this file, let's say we don't have any database work. So I'm going to delete this. We only want to write debugging messages about the application startup. So let's delete this db debugger function. And now we can rename this function startup debugger to debug. So look, that's shorter than writing console.log. And it gives us a lot more power and control over how much of the debugging information we want to see. So prefer the debug module to console.log statements.